expert panelists today as we try and tackle what does youth activism look like in between election cycles. Thank you very much for joining us. We love your participation. So don't forget that you can hit us up on the chat throughout this discussion and also on our social media accounts. Youth Capital is, of course, one that wants to amplify as many youth voices as possible and ensure that activism continues not only in the run-up to an election, but also in between election days themselves. Let me introduce our panelists for today. We have the Managing Director of Youth Lab, Pearl Pillay, joining us alongside recovering chartered accountant and financial activist Kaya Sithole. Caitlin Rawson, she is a political commentator that you'll normally see lighting up TikTok. And we're, of course, also joined by Jordan Peters, the activist filmmaker, and someone that I think is very critical to this discussion is Matshidiso Lenyosa. She is the chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition and essentially a critical voice in trying to ensure that government spends our money, because don't forget it's our money, correctly. In electoral cycles, this is the Yes or No vodcast series by Youth Capital, and my name is Nicholas Bauer. Reach out to us on our chat feed, as well as our social media accounts. You can also hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Nicholas Bauer is my handle. So let's kick things off with maybe a very quick fire response to those election results. All of our panelists, if you can please jump on, I'll mention your name, and then if you can, after I call you out, just describe in maybe one word or at the most one sentence those election results. Didn't exactly see those ones coming. Pearl, maybe you want to get us started, please.
I mean, listen, I think your gasp was correct. Kind of shocking, kind of not really. I think for me, one of the biggest standouts was our voter turnout. We saw long queues and we spoke about all of the craziness around voting day, but our voter turnout was the lowest it's ever been. As for the election results themselves, I mean, all of the polling people called it, Ipsos called it. And so we were expecting the ANC to dip the way they did. I think the big standouts for me was that the EFF didn't do as well as they usually do and couldn't kind of grow from the base that they had created. Obviously, everyone's going to talk about the rise of the MK, but I think specifically the new smaller parties, so parties like Rise Mzansi, who were very kind of well-resourced but didn't manage to secure a lot of votes, I think were kind of standouts. But generally, I think, good for democracy, good for competition, good for getting politicians to actually try and work together. But, definitely the start of a very exciting movie.
Certainly. Pearl Pillay giving her thoughts on those election results. Caitlin, you are a political commentator that blows up TikTok regularly. I mean, did you also see this coming, or were you at all surprised? What was the big takeaway for you?
I think to summarize it, it was predictable yet surprising. I mean, the polls and everything were predicting kind of a similar outcome to what we ended up getting. But I don't think anyone was really, or very few people were very fully convinced by the polling that we were seeing beforehand, and even the predictions that were coming out as the results were trickling in. I would very much agree with the assessment that it's a little bit, I was a little bit surprised by just how well the MK had done. I think everyone was expecting them to do well in KZN, but to see that then translate nationally was a little bit surprising to me personally. And again, also the EFF not necessarily capitalizing as much on the ANC's losses as they potentially could have in light of the MK doing so well. So I definitely think there were some elements that were surprising, but I mean, the polls were there. It's just, I don't think anyone expected the polls to be quite so correct.
Yeah, true. I mean, the signs were there all along, and we can't say that we could have been that surprised at the end of the day, although really there's a lot of uncertainty that lays ahead. The National Assembly now the focal point. Are we going to have a government by the end of the week? Jordan Peters, thank you very much for your time. What's your take on the elections? What's your big takeaway?
Good morning to you and the other panelists. I mean, as a start, I would say I always enjoy the drama of an election season. And this, of course, has been the most dramatic, I think, in a while. But as an activist, as a grassroots activist, I would say I'm quite unmoved. The work that I was doing before continues, and the issues that we face, I'm based in Cape Town, continues. And jaded, I would say, and I think that's also reflected in the voter turnout, as Paul mentioned. So jaded, cynical, unmoved, just here for the drama, which continues as we head to Friday.
I know, right? I mean, there were so many political parties that were saying 1994, this is a repeat, 2024 is our 1994, and didn't really come out in the results there, especially the parties like Rise Mzansi that really nailed their colors to the mast with that slogan. I mean, let's talk about money for a second. You guys, the two of you that are left, Machidisa and Kaya, I mean, your expertise lie in the finance of it all. And let's be honest, I mean, when it comes down to it, economics rules over everything. It flows, every decision in government and in society flows from where the money is going. And Machidisa, I mean, are we witnessing any great shakeups here? I mean, what was your big takeaway from the election? The ANC did drop, but it doesn't look as though there's going to be an earth-shattering change in direction when it comes to the economy.
That's an interesting point. And I think the money aspect of it just supports what all the previous panelists have said about. So actually, before the elections leading up to it, I'd read a study that was published by the MIT that found that when a government cuts budgets, which we've seen in South Africa as well, but they studied 200 election results in Europe and found that when there's a 1% cut to the budget, there's a 3% increase in support for extreme parties or like more populist parties. And then we also see lower voter turnouts. And when just watching the turnouts, like the election results, and then also just how the elections went out, like I stood in line for 7.5 hours at Wits. We saw the impact of the budget cuts that had been done to the IEC, and we see, first a combination of a jaded young population, so people did not even exercise their hard-won democratic freedom because they're just so disenfranchised by a system that just parties are making all these political promises, but what is the point? And they're very big, but if there's no if the fiscal policy or the budgeting doesn't align with these promises, what really is the point? So I can definitely see that sentiment, especially as captured by Jordan Peters, that I think that's really what the young people of this country are communicating, which is quite concerning to me.
Certainly. Kaya, your take there? I mean, it looks like the government of national unity is going to be stitched up and cobbled together, and we're going to have economic orthodoxy. And in many ways, I mean, economic orthodoxy has led to the current status quo, the highest rate of sustained unemployment in the world, ticking time bomb among the very many ticking time bombs that South Africa has, youth unemployment remaining staggeringly high. What's the big takeaway from the election for you? Do you think that people are just opting out of the democratic process?
Good morning to everyone. So I think obviously in relation to the question of the turnout that Pearl mentioned, it is remarkably concerning that in a cycle where the IEC spent so much trying to increase registrations, where so much was deployed towards galvanizing young people to be onboarded into the process, we still didn't see the type of good turnout that should have been commensurate with those efforts. And of course, questions around whether we should actually embed, voter education into our educational programs throughout school will always emerge when we see that just how disconnected we tend to be from the citizens out there. So I think that was obviously the great disappointment for me, in that not enough people actually showed up. And of course, what that also did is that it obviously translated to the new crisis of the ANC, in that the ANC would say that they've got a strong base of around 10 million voters that always pop up whenever there's an electoral cycle. And we saw that those voters themselves didn't show up. And of course, that contributed significantly to the electoral losses that we saw for the ANC. And also, obviously, a lot of them defected to the MK party. So it was a double crisis for the ANC itself. Now, of course, the big concern is what the implications are for public governance going forward. And I think the reality is that even if the ANC had won this election, the question of trying to balance the public purse has been dribbling them for a while. And I think when there's going to be many more voices across the table, many more conflicting views and opinions about what needs to be allocated and what needs to be prioritized, it's not going to be an easy process for everyone. It's not going to be an easy process for anyone. And I think obviously the history that we know is that some of the deliberations relating to public resources have essentially have not been deliberations at all, because the ANC has been fully in charge of all the parliamentary committees. So everything that the ANC wished became a fact. It became a reality. And I think obviously now under this new dispensation, there's going to be much more difficult conversations, maybe more robust conversations, and we do not know what the implications are going to be for the rollout of public services that are critical to the viability of the nation. So it's not going to be an easy exercise, but of course, that's what the voters have said needs to be done in the way that they voted on the 29th of May.
Yeah, I mean, you look at those numbers, they're not pleasant reading at all. Less than 59% voter turnout of registered voters. But for me, the most shocking part of this, 40% is the number that people keep on worrying about, or at least have been surprised about from this election. The ANC scoring 40% and dropping below that 50% mark for the first time in democratic history. But for me, the big 40% number there is that less than 40% of the voting population, the overall eligible voting population, actually bothered to register to vote and turn out on election day. It certainly does not bode well for the future, and something needs to be done going forward. If you just joined us, yes or no, the vodcast webinar series by Youth Capital. We want to hear from you, our audience. A chat option is always open to you, as well as on our social media profiles. You can also hit me up, nicolausbauer@x.com, formerly of Twitter. So let's talk about the coalition governments itself. I mean, what does that mean going forward? We're going to touch on the economy and spending in a second, but maybe give us a political lay of the land, the way that you see it, Caitlin. I mean, did we ever expect such a interesting set of potential bedfellows here? The ANC shacking up with the DA and the IFP. I mean, some might argue that the ground was being laid for this in the run-up to the election already, but it's not like the ANC didn't have other options. I mean, they could have easily formed a government with maybe an EFF and PA coalition, or possibly even swallowing some of their pride and trying to bring MK back into the fold. Politically, where do you see things?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the ANC had a lot of options. We've got a lot of the smaller political parties that have maybe 1 or 2 seats in parliament now as a result of these elections. But those 1 and 2 seats, if they add up, they can actually make a difference. And we look at an idea of an ANC EFF coalition, which is a coalition that might make sense in some cases. And we can see that a pure ANC EFF coalition doesn't get over the line by itself, but there's a lot of other smaller parties that might be willing to join into that sort of coalition. Obviously, we have the idea of a DA-ANC coalition, and the groundwork has been laid that in terms of kind of policy that we've been seeing from the ANC, they're definitely moving more towards policies that would align better with the DA. So we can see a sort of a harmony there in terms of potential policies that could work if the ANC continues its kind of more centrist push that it's been on under Ramaphosa's leadership. So that is definitely a viable option. But ultimately, what the ANC has decided to do is call for this government of national unity. And this has been a good option for them in terms of they haven't had to commit to working with an opposition in a very formal sense of a coalition. It's an open invitation to parties that wish to join in on that. And the ANC gets to kind of position itself as this almost upstanding party of like, we're being so great by offering out this invitation and welcoming everyone into this broad coalition, this broad government of national unity, but they also then get to retain kind of the upper hand in saying that we've not compromised on working with an MK in a formal coalition, for example, which might be a little bit of an embarrassment to the ANC, or we've not compromised by working with the DA in a formal coalition that will then pull our policies potentially more centrist and further away from their kind of socialist origins as a party. So it is an interesting option for the ANC to have chosen. It'll be interesting to see exactly how it plays out. We know that a lot of parties haven't necessarily been too willing to warm up to this idea of the government of national unity. We've already had, obviously, the MK saying that they are not really willing to engage with it. The EFF has also expressed their opposition to the GNU. So it'll be interesting to see if we do get this ultimate government of national unity that the ANC is calling for, who exactly will be involved in that, and which parties are going to say, well, actually, rather would stand as an opposition party.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. I mean, the ANC trying to, if you want to follow the analogy, playing the role of sort of village elder or matriarch or patriarch, trying to bring everybody into the tent under the banner of unity. But let's talk about the nitty-gritty of money. All right, South Africa's finances were not looking well in the run-up to the election. And Kaya Sithole, I mean, is it a case of us opening up the finances of South Africa any more than they are, or are we going to see some serious budget cuts if we bring the likes of the DA and the IFP into a governing arrangement with the ANC? I mean, how do you see things progressing from an economic point of view?
Well, I think the reality of budget cuts was already inked in long before we had these elections. In fact, it's been the ANC that's been on that particular drive, because if you listen to the Minister of Finance, he keeps explaining the fact that, look, he thinks the debt ceiling needs to stabilize at some particular point, and he thinks there need to be greater fiscal discipline throughout the system. So the cutting actually started even before we had these particular elections. The problem, of course, is the simple question of what gets cut and how much it gets cut. And I think the example that we've seen here in Gauteng, for example, is that the Department of Social Development was the one that was prioritized for the deepest cuts. And you've seen a lot of NGOs and NPOs that have had to go to court just to compel that particular department to honor its existing obligations. And of course, that's good in relation to existing obligations, but that simply means that what the government is likely to do is simply not renew those commitments, which means that further down the line, we're going to have this crisis again. And we also obviously have to be a bit more diligent in trying to figure out exactly what precipitated these deep funding cuts. And I think a lot of people have been speculating that some of the political noise that was generated in the lead up to the elections in relation to some of the new initiatives that the Premier of Gauteng was suddenly launching without explaining the consultation and the budgeting process behind it. Maybe that's where the funds went, and that's where the scrutiny is going to become particularly important. But obviously, when you then add onto the conversation parties that feel that, well, we are not responsible for the mess that you guys have created over the 30 years. These are not the parties that are going to promote an agenda that says, well, let's invest more in society, let's spend more. These are the parties that are likely to say, wait, hold on, we don't want to be tied up in an arrangement where there's already particular issues relating to how much you spend and the quality of the spend. So they're more likely to actually support the austerity program that you already know is already underway. So what I've been saying for a very long time is that we've got an undeclared austerity program in that the ANC government has been cutting left, right, and center without actually clearly stating that that's what they need to do. And you also have this conflicts that then emerged in on the eve of the elections, where the same ANC that's been saying that it's struggling to fund the social wage then makes a commitment to basic income in the immediate term. They make a commitment to solidifying the social relief grant, but all of those things are unbudgeted by that same particular party. So it's very, very difficult to imagine how we're going to navigate these waters easily. It's definitely going to be a very, very tricky time, regardless of who they end up in alliance with.
Yeah, I mean, the ANC is really guilty of always talking left and then walking right, with a bit of a forked tongue on these issues. Youth activism is really the main reason we're here today. I'm going to bring Jordan and Pearl in a moment, but to end this conversation about what it means for the money, where the budget's going, Matshidiso, I mean, you're from the Budget Justice Coalition. This sort of mess of political directions that we're going to have to try and navigate over the next 5 years, what does it mean for tackling big things like youth unemployment, or even trying to include into the budget measures to try and address things that lead to unemployment in general? Where do you see that going, Machiliso?
So yeah, I think Kayo has touched on the fiscal consolidation that has reflected as austerity measures that has probably caused. I mean, in our view as the Budget Justice Coalition, we've seen it to be the cause of the fiscal policy that the government has undertaken to be the cause of the issues that we face and to exacerbate some of the suffering that people in this country, especially young people, are facing. As we know that with youth unemployment, young people disproportionately bear the burden of unemployment in this country. But in those unemployment statistics, it is young Black women who are most overrepresented. And so when you have a budget and decisions, when you look at the manifestos of the various political parties, they make all these bold promises. But when you look at what they're saying about economic policy, it seems to, nothing inventive, nothing imaginative, nothing to address some of the concerns of those issues of like, why can't we actually realize these, for instance, these youth economic youth unemployment programs? Why are they being cut? Why is NSFAS, like, how do we reverse those budget cuts towards NSFAS? So yes, there's a lot of political talk. Yes, the ANC is definitely guilty of walking left and talking right, as you've mentioned, Nicholas, but all the parties, I would say, outside of the more extremist parties, are anti-austerity. So I think it was you who mentioned that the MK party's manifesto is notoriously or reflects an anti-austerity measure position. And so even though it is quite concerning what happens in the next 5 years, what that looks like, perhaps, the political parties say one thing, but they're actually quite similar. When the market talks and there's conversations from market commentators about what the government should look like, I think that it will be interesting and there might be an opportunity in a context of like such a fragmented parliament, is that we might have an unusual support in Parliament when we speak about the impact of doing budget cuts or undertaking fiscal consolidation without considering the human rights implications. So it does seem quite doom and gloom, and it could be. But I think also at the same time, as young people, this could be an opportunity to really push and show that if this isn't solved, we're just delaying an inevitable crisis in this country.
Right. It's good that you mentioned putting our shoulder to the wheel and pushing, because Pearl Pillay, how do you think young people in South Africa can not only remain engaged in between electoral cycles, but what's the best way for them to approach activism to try and ensure that the pressure remains on those elected officials? They all talk a very good game in the run-up to an election, and then they seemingly ghost the youth afterwards. How can young people ensure that they remain engaged and that the ticking time bomb of youth unemployment actually gets diffused at some stage?
So I think it's a few things, right? The one is around voter education. And I think this election specifically highlighted just the complete crisis that our voter education state is in, right? We don't know the difference between provincial government and local government. We don't know what parliament is meant to do. We don't know, we had 3 ballots in this election, and it's not just a youth issue, right? Across the board. Part of the reason why people queued so long at voting stations is because people had to explain over and over again what the 3 ballots was for, right? I had to explain to IEC officials in the morning when I got to my voting station what the 3 ballots were for, because they were one of the people that worked at the voting station were like, oh, why do we have extra ballots, right? And so I think that's the one thing that we need to keep doing as youth organizations and as people who are plugged in, is to continue the work of voter education. We've got local elections coming up in 2 years' time, and that's going to be really critical for what happens in our communities. And so we really need to put our hands up and just educate each other and inform each other so that we know what what our votes mean. We know what officials are meant to do. We know what governments are meant to provide, right? So we know, for example, what a provincial government should do versus what a municipal government should do. But I think broadly around holding people accountable, we've got our sitting of the National Assembly on Friday. All parliamentarians are assigned constituencies, for example. We need to find out as young people, who are the parliamentarians responsible for our constituencies? Get in contact with them, find out what their plans are for the communities that we come from, right? So the idea is to get as much information as possible, but actually create a dynamic relationship with our parliament. I think so often we elect leaders and they go sit in parliament and we see parliament as this thing that's divorced from all of us. But it's our parliament, right? The people there are paid by our tax money. And we have a responsibility to engage with them and make the work of parliament continue. It's things like commenting on bills that are up for public comment, right? It's even just watching parliamentary proceedings. Look at who's prepared for a portfolio committee meeting, for example. Look at who's sleeping when we're sitting and watching the National Assembly, because these are people that took votes and they're meant to do something with it. And if you show up and you've not done the reading, or you've not adequately prepared for a meeting that you're in, we as citizens need to be able to, I think, publicly shame these people, right? Why were you sleeping in Parliament? Why did you not do the reading for the committee you're meant to be in? And so I think there's a way for us to build that relationship with our public officials to say, we weren't just watching during elections. We weren't just glued to our screens waiting for results, right? We weren't just now waiting to see what happens on Friday, but actually we're going to stay engaged. And I think part of it is just to understand the functions of these different institutions and the roles that they play for our communities, and then using organizations like Youth Capital, like Youth Lab, to actually get access into these spaces and hold people accountable.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much for that one, Pearl. Jordan, let me bring you in here and talk about the actual nitty-gritty of the activism that Pearl is talking about. Shaming the public representatives that are not doing a very good job of representing the people. What does that look like? Should we make videos of them sleeping in Parliament? Should we make videos of them, I don't know, living their lives up at Groove on the weekend while they're sleeping in Parliament or asking stupid softball questions? I mean, has it come to that point now where we need to get the youth engaged and maybe even move beyond the traditional protest of coming and physically protesting in front of Parliament or, toying? Do we need to try and get creative and maybe get a little bit more physically engaged, online or offline?
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, we already have those videos circulating, right? And it has been for years of the MPs sleeping, saying really ridiculous things in Parliament. So I'm not really sure what difference it would make if, we use that as a strategy. And my activism and my work has always been predicated on history. I see myself as a ghetto historian. And so I always ask the question, what were our people doing before we could vote? And if you look at the 80s, we look at the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, our people were organized in their communities, in their church groups, in their cultural groups, in their sports groups. And for me, as a young activist, I'm like, that is clearly the response, that is clearly the answer to the quagmire we find ourselves in. So when we ask ourselves the question, okay, what does accountability look like? Firstly, I think we need to step away from the national legislature and go all the way down to the ward councillor. I always say, where does your ward councillor live? Do you know how much your ward councillor gets in their budget each year? Those are the type of, I think, accountability mechanisms, if we're talking within a democratic process, that I think makes the most sense and is the most viable, particularly, I think, understanding the fact that most young people, you go to them and you tell them, hold your MPs accountable, they're going to look at you like, what does this democratic process have to do with the fact that I can't afford bread, that I can't afford the taxi fare to get to my job interview, that my school is completely run down and one could even say abandoned. So I would say, I guess response to this is to say that we are deserted, we are by ourselves. And it's not just, now, it's been like that for a very long time. So I'm not an anarchist, but I will say though that there's
It sounds like you're getting close to that though, eh?
It's the jadedness coming through. But I think that there's a need for us to look around and be realistic and say that, okay, democracy and the different electoral processes is one mechanism for change. But if we look at our history as a people, it wasn't through, we didn't see change through the ballot box. And I'm going to say something a bit cynical and possibly problematic. But I think that there is also a need, when we talk about young people mobilizing and being organized, for us to divest from these mainstream NPOs, right? Because I think that NPOs are very important in this country in terms of being watchdogs, being lobby groups. But in terms of organizing and activism, I think that NPOs in many ways have sucked the organizing capacity from our communities, right? So young people, when they understand organizing, they think, okay, we need to do it through this NPO that gets millions, is unregulated. And that money, ironically, also came in during apartheid, but it came in directly to communities and to activists. And so I work with a lot of young activists, a lot of young people who are dedicated, who are active in their communities, who work in the communities that they are actually from. And we are often having to share the peanuts that we have amongst ourselves, doing incredibly important work, young teachers, young social workers, trying to effect change on the ground. And we have absolutely no resources at all. So if we want to be serious about young people organizing themselves and, really pushing for accountability, really pushing to change the society at large, we need to look at how we can capacitate them. And the easiest way to capacitate young people who are already doing the work is to give them resources. And I think that social media, and I mean, to your question, social media is an important part of that. And I think, the work that Caitlin does, for example, it has been incredibly important, in the run up to elections. But we must also realize that social media can only take us to a particular point, and actually speaking to each other, actually having these conversations. And lastly, I'll also say that I think there's a need to also analyze what's happening in South Africa through a global lens. We are seeing a surge of right-wing, I guess, a right-wing wave hitting the entire world. And that's also happening in South Africa, and social media is also a part of that. So even as the left, as the progressive wing of, I guess, the South African landscape, we also need to start being more critical and more, I guess, what's the word? Proactive when it comes to social media, because the right has taken technology and social media and made it a tool, and we're just kind of always responding, and we've seen a small shift, but it's not a big enough shift. And so again, the work is on the ground, the work is in our communities, and it's difficult work, it's grueling work, it's tedious work, it's tiring work, but there is no shortcuts to organizing young people. It needs to be done on the ground.
Jordan Peters, thank you for that very, very conclusive answer there. I can see that you're jaded. And let's be honest, I mean, look at the history of South Africa. Democracy was achieved at the ballot box, but the sustained activism and indeed not only protest, violent and otherwise, against the apartheid government also delivered us to that point eventually. I mean, you only need to look at the very politically charged and explosive era of the 80s for proof of that. And Caitlin, let me bring you into this. Do you think that we need to renew efforts? Young people, do they need to think about different ways and maybe try and not just be more engaged, but try and think of new methods to make sure that politicians not only take notice, but actually start to sing to the tune that young people want?
Yeah, and I think this conversation of like Jordan was mentioning about social media and the role of it is very important, because we've seen social media emerge as now this new platform where people can hold each other accountable, and you can make a call out video and say that this is something that you're upset about and raise lots of awareness on various different issues. And it's something that I am very passionate about in the content that I produce. And like Pearl was talking about earlier, like voter education and just education on the political landscape is such an important thing to be pushing for, because there's a lot of people who want to be more informed on these topics, but they don't know where to begin. And social media can be a great starting point for that. And that's what I try and do with the content and the videos that I produce. But there's two sides to that as well, in that it can just be a starting point. Is if your activism starts and ends at social media, then how far are you actually going with it? And there needs to be this like push to do more, and also get like involved in communities and things that are happening on the ground, not just keeping all of your activism and all of your efforts online and purely online. And then also there are the drawbacks of social media, in that it's a almost completely unregulated space, in terms of anyone can get on social media and make a video saying anything. And as consumers and as audiences of viewers of social media, you need to be quite aware of what you are consuming and who is saying certain things and with what agenda they're saying it with, because not everyone can be trusted with the information that they're giving. And of course, that's not to say that everyone is coming with malicious intent necessarily, or that there's lots of people with malicious intent on social media, but there are also like very well-meaning people who can sometimes get things wrong. And I've done it before in some of my content, and it's very easy to make a small mistake. And the important thing is then how you address that and move forward from that, and how you take accountability on that. But unfortunately, and this is also where it comes in again to the play with it can't be all online, is when you're on social media, it's very easy to just get lost in the profile pictures and the usernames and not see people as people that you're interacting with. And then it gets very easy to be put into this very defensive mindset of, oh, I've been called out on social media, or someone's made a misstep and now you are making a call out video on them, or you're trying to hold someone accountable. But a lot of the times it can be done in a way that's quite counterproductive, in that you're not actually fostering the dialogue and the sorts of conversations that are needed for progress to actually happen. And it just gets devolved into this kind of shouting match of who can attack someone the most and who can make the most inflammatory post that's going to get the most likes and the most engagement. Because unfortunately, that's also what does well on social media, is a post talking about like a very nuanced discussion of considering different sides of an argument and considering different perspectives is not always going to do as well as a post that's saying this is a terrible person and we should all be attacking them and everyone go unfollow them because they're awful. Everyone call them out because they're like have these terrible opinions. And again, that's something that then can quite easily devolve into becoming unproductive. And it's not always, we need to have the room for nuance. And a lot of the time that nuance comes from taking things off of social media and actually having a conversation with someone in person, where you're actually recognizing them as a person and as in community with someone, that this is someone that's part of your society, that this is someone that ultimately we would hope that we all want better for our country, for our world, for our communities. And if we can work towards that, not just online, but in person as well, I think that makes the process a lot easier.
Certainly, I get the feeling that these fatalist conversations really dragging someone through the mud or ending them, cancelling them, kind of does the opposite of what we're hoping for. I mean, it repositions the enemy as someone that could be walking shoulder to shoulder with you against the true enemy of youth unemployment that's represented by disengaged public representatives. But Kaya, you spoke a little bit earlier about the drop in funding for NGOs. What do you say to the point that Jordan made earlier about a lot of the big NGOs are in many ways like corporates? They have huge budgets, they have a lot of bureaucracy, they have a lot of red tape, and not to say that money shouldn't be spent properly, but I mean, there's no trickle-down effect. Once again, you can criticize it in the many ways that trickle-down economics in an economy works. If you pump money into the top, does it really head down from the ivory towers into the grassroots impact space that is needed? I mean, do you think that there's merit to what Jordan is saying there?
Yeah, so I do think that we have a problem of how resources are allocated even in the civil society space. And I think obviously the question of whether we prioritize the institutions or the organizations that make the greatest impact on society versus those that are probably benefiting from proximity to those decision makers is a remarkably important one. And I think some of the patterns that we've seen is that obviously those that probably enjoy greater proximity to those types of legacy resources are the ones that are always in prime position to influence the design of, information requests and proposal requests, and that puts them at the front of the line of actually just receiving that type of financial support. And what we should actually be trying to figure out is whether in the spectrum of organizations that exist out there, we have a very clear definition of what type of social impact is required, and therefore find organizations that do that much better than others. And I think obviously organizations that are more embedded in communities probably have a much greater chance of achieving the greatest impact given the proximity that they have to community issues and to community members at large. And I think it's something that obviously has not been as well explored as it needs to be. And that simply means that there is definitely a bit of a void or a vacuum in the resource allocation mechanism that we see even in civil society.
Well, let me bring you back in here. What is the mindset change or direct transformation that you see happening among young people following this election in order to bring about the change that we keep on talking about? And maybe if you can point out grassroots organizations that are doing good work on the ground. What are is there a formula for identifying them? And if a young person wants to get involved with an organization that is actually having an impact, what do they need to look out for?
Cool. So I think maybe the one thing is to see that the way young people are thinking about organizing and mobilizing in their communities is changing, right? So the idea of a traditional kind of organization or like a formal institution through which people organize is not really happening at large scale anymore. Young people are organizing socially, they're organizing through churches or school groups or just their group of friends who want to actually do something in their communities, right? And they look out for other organizations that already may exist in their communities to partner with them and collaborate on programming or initiatives that they want to see happen. What we've been doing at Youth Lab is a project called the South African Youth Manifesto. And it's a program where we go across the country and we speak to young people and youth organizations around the key question is, if young people had to write their own election manifesto, what does that look like, right? And what it really is understanding what are our perceptions of democracy and how do we as young people find ourselves fitting in or not, right? One of the big things that has come out from our work thus far, and we've covered 7 provinces so far, is that number one, young people are incredibly weirded out by the way we elect our officials, right? So the idea of proportional representation versus constituency-based voting, right? Why can't we have leaders sitting in parliament that actually come from our communities? And I think that's kind of a little bit of what that mindset shift is that you're talking about, to say, actually, what really matters is what happens at local level, right? What really matters is whether or not I open a tap in my home and I get water, whether I have access to a good public school, right? Whether the clinics in my community are well resourced. And so people are feeling the gap between national government and local experiences kind of increasing. And so we're looking at more community-based interventions. We're looking at things that actually affect materially our everyday lives, right? So we talk about youth unemployment, but what does that actually mean, right? It doesn't mean that, we're having this big conversation about what the markets are going to do. And I know Kaya may want to shoot us for this, right? But it's not about these big, broad level conversations about the economy and the rand and all of that, right? It's about the fact that there are so many young people that are heading up households that just don't have jobs. And so I think a big mindset shift is towards more community-based issues rather than the kind of broad national discussions that we're having, and looking at the ways in which our leaders actually affect our lives in a very direct way. But organizing is also, I think, changing because people are not necessarily looking for big formal structures, right? So one of the big questions we ask people is around whether or not they think it's important to be members of political parties. And largely what we're seeing in the 2019 election, most young people that we'd spoken to for this project had said, yes, it is important to be members of political parties. In our current conversations, people are saying, well, what is the point of a political party outside of contesting elections? We don't see political parties being activists in our communities and earning our votes. All they do is campaign. And so people are looking at the ways that we rethink about what our election system looks like. What does it mean to be a public representative? What is the role of community organizations, the role of political parties? And most importantly, like Jordan was speaking about earlier, resources, right? Young people are already organized. People are already doing work in their communities. There isn't a big NPO or government institution that's going to save people, right? People have always been incredibly active. And what they often lack is access to spaces where their activism can actually affect change, but also actual resource support. And so I think in the ways that people are shifting mindsets right now is it's about, well, what kind of resources do we need to help each other? And how do we create partnerships with people that can actually further those goals rather than getting access into like big national spaces?
Well, thank you very much for that, Pearl. Jordan, I'm going to bring you in a moment or so, but I want Machidisa to tell me examples of practical ways you can not only, as a young person, stay involved in the political process, but also from an economic point of view, drive accountability from a grassroots level. I mean, Pearl spoke earlier about how many people know where the councillor lives and what resources they have to make an impact in the community. So what are the practical things and maybe examples of grassroots organizations that you know of that a young person can get involved in to ensure that they A, know where the money is going, and B, where to put the pressure to ensure that the money flows in the right way?
Sure, thank you. So I think maybe I'll tie in the answer to this question to some of the discussion that we've been having around resources and how, talking about trickle down economics and how much of a fast that is. And we see that in South Africa. So on the one hand, I mean, I'm in full support, especially as someone, so I work in the NGO space. And so the sentiments that I think especially Jordan has raised about, well, who's getting all the money is something that has been, something that's been weighing on my heart, knowing that sometimes, when I'll be on a panel or be working on programs that I'm funded by a specific funder, but that program or that government is also funded by the same. So it almost seems like we're funded by the same person or the same organization, but we're at odds with each other. What's the point? It makes it, I can't help but feel jaded when I think about that. However, I still think at the end of the day, in spite of the shortcomings and how the political system has failed young people in this country, I still think that it's crucial for us to remember that we are the taxpayers. So whether you are earning a salary or whether you are buying goods, like just consuming goods, you contribute to this. So the money that they're stealing, the money that they're not using, the budgets that they're cutting, those are our resources. And it's really important for us as young people to know that, to take ownership of that. So yes, the community structures so important, and building our activism from the ground up instead of having, large NPOs imposing, but also equally taking ownership of that, what's happening on the national, the fiscus. When we talk about markets, knowing that no, the country and these political institutions and these representatives have a constitutional obligation to us. So if the market is saying that, no, the budget for healthcare needs to be cut, but that constrains the resources available to provide quality access to quality healthcare services for young people in this country, that is something that must be challenged, because the market might not be underpinned by the constitution, but the government is. And so I think it is really important to do that. And I think talking about community and talking about individuals is that I guess I'd give an example of the Budget Justice Coalition and how, right now, like just being frank, like we're unfunded. And so a lot of that activism comes from, there are people who represent NPOs, and then there are also individuals who are part of this, because, we're all trying to advance economic justice. And I think that's really an example of like a coalition that works, is that instead of listen, everybody has an equal, or maybe not even an equal. In fact, people who are from individual or from a community base should have a stronger voice, even if they don't have the same resources and backing of an international NGO, but their voice, because the issue, what's missing from the budget process is the human rights aspect that needs to be brought to the foreground. And so when we have our submissions and when we engage with Parliament, we're not just speaking from a script that's done by a funder. We're enforcing and invigorating it with our own lived experiences. I'm a young person and who was until very recently mostly dependent on aid and government and public services that work. So the idea of like abandoning those things, it does concern me, and obviously that's not what is being said here. So I really do think that examples of that is like just young people coming together, regardless of or because of our various backgrounds, and seeing the diversity of our perspectives and using it to come together, that when it's budget speech, we recognize that the budget isn't working for us, but not only that, but we challenge them and let them know that actually you guys are failing us by doing this. You're listening to the market. You're not listening to the people on the ground. You're not listening to us as young people. You're favoring one over the other. It has implications. It influences the way that media reports on the budget, for instance, because, if we don't say something, then you'll hear budget speech things are like, oh, this was a great budget because the market is happy with it. But if the market is happy with it, but the young people are not happy with it, that needs to be questioned. And yes, we have a long way to go. But I do think that many of these freedoms, I think as Jordan mentioned, they were hard-won freedoms. They were in, violent protests that resulted in some form of democratic process. And just because it's not working for us, we should just protect our these hard-won freedoms from the youth before us, because they're going to get co-opted by people who have nefarious reasons and who are using, so I do think, like, yes, from a community level, but community-based organization level, we absolutely need to be mobilized, but also as young people who are in spaces like NGOs or in government or in the media, we should be working with each other and working with the community and coming together as like forming our own version of a coalition, showing government what a real coalition looks like that is foregrounded in the human rights of young people in this country.
Kaya, I definitely want to hear from you in a moment or so, your thoughts on that. I mean, about economic orthodoxy, but I'm reminded of the Freedom Charter, that guiding document for so many political parties. It says very clearly, the people shall govern, not the financial markets. And the argument very often is that it's economics by people that are very, very well-heeled and rich in ivory towers, far away from the people making the decisions that impact the people. But before I come to you, Jordan, I want to speak to your jadedness at the moment. I mean, what are you going to do for the next 5 years? And what do you think young people should do? Because some might feel it's getting to the point that we do need to go to a mode of doing things where we toy, where we violently protest, where stuff gets burnt, because that's the way people can listen. Are you thinking about that?
I mean, as someone who's actually been arrested at a protest and who had to appear 5 times for assaulting a police officer, which I deny, I would never encourage people to just protest and put their bodies on the line and be brutalized. And I'll tell you what I am currently doing and what I intend to do for the next 5 years. So I'm the co-founder of an organization called Keiko, and this also speaks to what Pearl was saying about how young people organize, and some of them are actually attending Hey Guys. But Keiko is essentially, it's a non-partisanal youth political formation, right? And it's actually an organization that existed in the 80s. We stole their name with their permission, of course. But again, to go back to history, and I think that we are blanketed with this collective amnesia in South Africa. Young people used to be organized in this country. Youth political formations were the sharp edge of our society, and organized bus boycotts, organized school boycotts, organized consumer rent boycotts. Like, we come from 21-year-olds, taking on the might of an apartheid regime. And so for me, there's a need to build agency, and I think that building agency through history is an important part of reminding not just young people, but us as a society, of the power that we have. But also, I think there's a need for us to also take a step back and look at the intergenerational trauma that we are sitting with in this country. Because, we can talk about all these things in very siloed ways, but the reality is that we are dealing with the effects of colonialism, slavery, apartheid, all condensed, and now we have this democracy. So we also need to look at our people as a traumatized people, and a lot of the issues that these new political parties use, whether it be anti-Blackness, various forms of ethno-nationalism, is based in that, traumatic history. And I think that another reminder as well is that young people need to come as they are. We often want to go to young people and start talking about democracy and talk about voter education and think that that is the easiest means to get them into political spaces. It's not. Young people are politicized through sports groups. Young people are politicized through cultural groups. And the reason I'm saying that, and I mean, I've been very privileged to engage with a lot of anti-apartheid activists who were youth activists. And I used to ask them, but how did you guys manage that? Young people have just no interest in politics right now. And they told me that is actually how it was during apartheid as well. We have this conception of this mass movement. That mass movement took almost a century to build, right? And we saw the 80s as the kind of the last part of it. But young people were, interested in jobs.
Very much the destination as opposed to the journey.
Exactly. And I think that how, the tools of the trade is in our history, and we're always trying to recreate the wheel and democracy. But the reality is that what happened in the 80s was that there was a sports group, there was a soccer group, and there was maybe, a few of them who were political, and they would start inviting their friends into political spaces. As simple as that. There were church groups where there was one auntie or one uncle who was actually, a COVID ANC member, and he would start inviting people one by one. Like, the idea that we are going to politicize a whole generation of young people overnight, I think just is fanciful and doesn't speak to the hard work that it takes to actually mobilize young people. And so I think, just to, finish off, but also to reiterate what I said, the work of politicizing young people is grueling. It's going to take a long time. And that's why I'm also jaded, because whatever happens in Parliament is of course important, but the work that we need to do, as youth activists continues. And, we haven't even spoken about children, and their experiences as spectators in our society with almost no agency at all. They are going to be voters in the next 4 years, in the next 2 years. Nobody cares about them until they become voters. So the reality is that young people, children, youth, we are on our own, and there's a need for us to start looking to the past, and start looking at the issues in our society from a longer lens, and looking at these issues, I think, in a way that is actually forward moving. And I think Caitlin spoke to this as well. There's a posture of the left that is often condescending, whether it be about issues of identity, whether it be about issues of race and class. And we talk down at people if they don't give the right answer, or the answer that we feel, is the most progressive. And that, again, is just so ahistorical, because people we aren't born with politics. And so there's a need for us as the left, as the progressive sector of society, to also really reflect on our our impact, and whether our impact is what it is.
Well, certainly, Jordan, it does give rise to the feeling that if we squabble amongst ourselves, the only things that win are the things we are trying to change, because nothing will change if we spend our time arguing with each other. I hate to be that guy the time, speed, traffic cop, if you will. But time is drawing to a close, and I want to try and get a word out of everybody. We've got a range of questions here in the chat, and Kaya, I haven't forgotten about our economic orthodoxy question there, but Caitlin, we've got a question here from Jeremiah Kumane, and it's about the government of national unity. How do you think it can represent the interests of young citizens, regardless of their political affiliation and or background? Do you think that that is a possibility? Do you think that it can be a vehicle for that? And please try and keep your answer to no more than a minute. We need to start finishing off.
Personally, I'm very skeptical that the government of national unity can do any more to represent like a broad coalition of young people than the current ANC government or the previous ANC government now has been doing. I think that we also see like a severe lack of young people just in the political spaces, in these positions of power, and that has a huge influence. But yeah, I would say I'm very skeptical that the government of national unity will be much of a departure or much of a change from what we've been seeing previously anyway.
Okay, Pearl, bringing you back in here. Unfortunately, Kaya has a previous engagement and you won't be able to address us on that economic orthodoxy policy there. But also from Jeremiah, what mechanisms can be put in place to ensure transparency and accountability in decision-making processes in something as big as an unwieldy as a government of national unity? I mean, should a young person even try?
I mean, yeah, listen, I'm always going to be a proponent of trying, even when, you know, we all get frustrated and sometimes it looks like our efforts are in vain. But, you know, there's a reason that these systems have been created. There's a reason that we as citizens do have power. And it's important for us to exercise it wherever we can. I think there's a few ways that we can kind of look for transparency and hold people accountable through transparency mechanisms. One of them is around political party funding. So My Vote Counts has done absolutely spectacular work to advance the Political Parties Funding Act, but also to create a dashboard that tracks how much money political parties are getting and from who. That gives us a really good starting point, right? Because if you know who funds parties, you know what their interests are. And we can hold people accountable to say, why did so-and-so give you this amount of money? What have you been using that money for, right? And that trickles down all the way into government processes, right? Our budgets are transparent, right? Our members of parliament and our government official salaries are transparent, right? Those are all publicly accessible information. And I think what we need to do is interrogate those numbers even more, right? When a department sends back unused money, why was that money unused, right? What programs did they actually fund? And it takes a lot of work, and it's not work that all of us might be interested in. It's not work that or information that we all have easy access to, because if you don't know what to look for, what are you looking for, right? But I think you have excellent organizations like Youth Capital, you have people like My Vote Counts, you have people like Activate, you have content creators like Caitlin, who sit on social media and are kind of unplugged, right? And have access to so many platforms where you can make all of this information digestible. So the information is out there. We just need to know what to look for and how to actually use it. But I think things like interrogating budgets is a really good way to start. There's so much money that goes unspent in South Africa, right? And we sit and say, well, we don't have money to fund the nutrition program at schools. No, we do. Right? It's because money is not prioritized in correct ways, right? And we sit and we just look at fruitless and wasteful expenditure, but we don't know what that actually means. We don't know how budgeting actually works.
Protection for elected officials. I mean, having a look
at VIP protection. They scare that we're gonna shambok them in the streets, right? But if you're doing your job, nobody's gonna want to beat you up. And so it's just about learning what the different budgetary mechanisms are and what money is actually used for. And we've got so many great platforms and so many great content creators and organizations that already bridge that gap. So just to use all of that as much as we possibly can in the next few years.
It's been an illuminating conversation as always. It's the Yes or No election series with Youth Capital, our expert panel of youth activists that joined us today. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'm not going to leave this conversation without speaking about the Tetenge and employment card game that's been launched by Youth Capital. It's a conversation game that explores what it's like to grow up in South Africa as a young person and prompting conversations within communities themselves about what you are going to do as a young person. And I'm going to end this conversation with a question from that card game. Imagine the 1976 generation. The 1976 uprising. The fight against apartheid had somewhat stalled and then was completely reinvigorated by a few young people deciding that they had had enough. With that generation in mind, ask yourself this question as a young person. What am I standing up for today? Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I can welcome back our youth activists, our panelists today, to a future conversation on this yes or no series. We had it in the run-up to elections, but hopefully we can continue the conversation. Remember to hit us up on our social media platforms, as well as check out our website, Youth Capital. It's been a pleasure spending the past hour and a bit with you. Have yourself a fantastic Wednesday.